modification from what we discussed at the end of the meeting. You please hold your questions until the city manager asks you if you have any, because she wants to take some natural breaks in the presentation to entertain questions, but she'll let us know when that's appropriate. So if you have questions after the various sections, when she stops and asks if you have questions, that's the appropriate time to ask her questions about her presentation. So with that, Manager Stewart, it's all yours.
Do you need to call the meeting to order?
I thought I did, but go ahead. We'll call a meeting to order.
Do you need to do anything else?
Nope. Do I?
Need to do,
Workshop carrying on from a previous
For
meeting.
workshop?
Use
Not for
the,
workshop.
you want roll call? I don't have an agenda that says that. I just have workshop. That's all it says.
I have an agenda that says roll call.
Should have sent it
So do
to us.
I.
Send it to us. It's been in the packet.
It's in the packet.
Not in my packet.
So the agenda it should be at the very end before the budget. There's a roll call, a public comment, and then the presentation.
Well, that's just, then if you're going to require me to do that, you have to wait. I don't believe we have to do that, but I'll do it if you want. It's before
I
the,
don't think we do either.
it's before the budget presentation or before the budget.
Yes.
Page 73.
All right, we'll call to order the meeting, which is really just an extension of our other special meeting that we already started. Could we have a roll call, please?
Mayor Whipple,
Here in Mason, Michigan.
Mayor Pro Tem Brown,
Still here in Mason, Michigan.
Councilmember Clark,
Still here.
Councilmember Joseph,
Here from Mason, Michigan.
Councilmember Ferris,
Here, Mason, Michigan.
Councilmember Schaefer is still absent. Councilmember Vogel. You are muted.
Here from Mason, Michigan.
Thank you. We have a quorum.
Alrighty, where's this? There it is. I'm going to dispense with public comment. Okay, there isn't any public anyway, but we've already had our meeting with public comment. So the next item on our agenda is a presentation by the city manager and receipt of the fiscal year 2021-22 budget proposal. So go ahead, city manager.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen and hopefully you can see that. Can you see that, everyone? Okay. Okay, so we're going to talk obviously about the budget today. Ideally, in normal circumstances, we would have the CIP wrapped up in a bow and be going into the budget, really having a good handle of what capital we are directed to prioritize. And so I know we had some minor changes today. None of those are incorporated into the budget document. We will provide you with an updated budget document incorporating those. Hopefully it may not be before Monday, but it'll be close to that so that you can have that to consider with those changes. So I want to get right into it. Our agenda today is to talk about the community and revenue trends, the budget process, and then we'll go into detail by fund. Those are going to be some of the natural breaks so that we can ask questions or respond to questions you may have. So when we talk about community trends, this is the information that if you have a budget in front of you, it's in that budget trends section in the budget binder. These are some indicators that we like to look at to determine the health of the community and kind of how we're trending in revenue. They are not perfect. There's all kinds of data we can draw, but these are ones that we think are good indicators of what's happening in the community. So the first one, when we talk about community health, investment in property is really key. How are we doing on permits being issued, and what kind of value is increasing in the community? What's interesting is we had a couple of things happen in the last year that were a little bit unique in that we had a large hailstorm. And so that drove a lot of permits, 184 roof permits related to the hailstorm and hail damage. And they're still coming in. And so a lot of companies have aggressively approached our residents to try to get their roofs replaced and covered under their insurance. But our trend is still showing an increase in permits. We're at about 230, removing those. And so we're still seeing a large investment of rehab and construction in our community, which is a great sign. So when we talk about our top 10 property owners, I think this is really important information, and it gives you just an indicator of kind of how our tax base is split up and the things that we need to do to be more resilient as far as diversifying. And so you look here, Gestamp is still a huge percentage, but they are decreased. They increased a little bit this time, but if you looked from previous years, it's actually a decrease overall. And so we have Michigan Packaging Company, Beacon Lakes, Meyer Consumers is always, I think, a surprise for people because of how much property and easements they own. Dart Bank. But then we also added this interesting fact of how much percentage is our single family homes. I think it's really important that we also value those single family home residents, which is about 65%, just over 65% of our tax base. So as we're prioritizing projects and things like that, I think that shows you where that priority tax base is. So when we look at revenue trends, you know, obviously a big one that gets a lot of press, and especially with the MML, is state revenue sharing. And so when you look at the trends, one of the things you're going to see is that 19-20 year, you're going to see a sharp decrease. And that was supplemented by some of the recovery dollars that the state got as far as supplementing law enforcement, salaries, and things like that. So while we were made whole, some of the grants and things that we received are not actually additional money, if that makes sense. The state basically said, hey, we're going to cover that cost with a targeted grant so that will make you, closer to where you would be with statutory revenue sharing. It won't come out of the general fund, but these are costs that these grants that we received when you start to see the impacts of COVID, not all of those are extra dollars, if that makes sense. So when we start to talk about revenue trends, when we talk about general revenue property tax, that's that bottom blue line, and you're going to see it kind of dip, especially in that 13, 14 range, and then it starts to get up, but we're nowhere near where we would be at an average inflation rate. So that's always a challenge we have with costs increasing, costs of goods and services and things like that, yet our property tax is not matching that. So when we go to this breakdown of real and personal property, we did find an error that number in red should have been increased. It was slightly low in the previous information provided, so we'll update that in the final document. But this gives you the trends of where projections are, but also kind of gives you that breakdown of how we're growing and what percentage of change we're growing. So you can see some of those sharp decreases early on in 13 and 12, but even earlier before that, we also had some decreases because of the economic constraints. And then again, we get capped as you start to increase value. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, some real examples. So when we look at state equalized value versus taxable value, you start to see that this trend gets concerning, right? Because we're getting further and further away from the actual taxable value. For those of you, I know many of you are familiar, there's a state equalized value, which is 50% of the true cash value. And then we have the taxable value, which is that capped amount that really limits us in being able to grow at the same rate as the market. And this graph next in the next slide will show you how that's starting to split more and more. So that top item is the SEV, and the lower kind of teal color is the taxable value. And why this is important is that our costs are not trending up with that SEV value. When we talk about energy costs, regulations, medical costs, and materials, they're all increasing pretty significantly. I mean, we've had years of medical and health insurance increases of 5, 8, 10% during this time period. And so those costs are increasing, yet our revenues are not matching or keeping track with that. So one of the things that's key about Proposal A and the caps that it puts on our property taxes is the transition of homes. And so we always like to track how many home sales we've had in a year, how many single family home starts, and that average medium households price change. I found that it was an interesting decrease in 2020, and we did a lot of digging and trying to figure out, and what we realized was that it was really just a correction of the 2019 values. 2019 saw a big increase, and there's still a pretty large increase. Homes are going for a significant amount over what they're even asking. And so this is more of a correction. There was an increase, but it wasn't that 11.77 the previous year, needed a little bit of a cost correction. So it's important that our homes are transitioning. But when you look at this, we have about 2,400 single family homes in the city. And so you're talking about 6% of them are transitioning a year about. And this does not, we have some frequent flyers in these numbers. I know a few of them in particular that have transitioned homes every couple of years, and they flipped them or different things like that. And so these are not necessarily a true uncapping of every home. It could be a home that's uncapped multiple times in this time period.
Deb, excuse me. Deb,
Yeah,
I need to break in and ask Michelle to reset John DeRocha so he can use video, because he had to log back in. And he's not a co-host right now. He can't use his video. There we go. I bet he can now.
we got it. So we talk a lot about capping and uncapping, and I think sometimes that's hard to talk about so conceptually. So I wanted to use a real example. This is an example of an actual individual who called my office and complained about how much more taxes they were paying than the person before them. And so I pulled up their information, and when you start to look at the tracking of that, you can see why as a city we struggle to keep up with expenditures. So in 2007, it was constructed at a value, an SEB of 53,400. The lowest value it went to was in 2013, which we'll talk a lot about long tail trends in cities and property taxes. The impact is usually much longer of economic downturns than other areas. So this was the lowest that they reached, which is in 2013. So 2013, that lowest amount, now we start to be under that cap, right? Where we're only increasing by a certain amount. So we're still capped in 2020 with a value now of taxable 26,000, but an SEV of 47,000. And so when it uncaps, we go from a pretty dramatic taxable value of 26 to 55,000. And so this is obviously shows you the challenges with this uncapping in market value. And so the longer someone stays in a home, if this person had stayed in their residence for longer, it would take more than the 14 years to get back to their value. But even this home alone took 14 years. So when we talk about millage comparisons, because everyone wants to know from a tax-based perspective, are we out of line? Where do we fit in? You guys have seen this slide before. This gives you a little bit of the history of when we have raised taxes. And the last time we did was in 2017. We moved up to 15.25. And this shows you a comparison of where we are compared to location or population. That's kind of what we focus on. And that's why we create that category of why do we compare. So, we're looking at Grand Lodge because they have a similar population. We're looking at, Delhi and Meridian, not because they have a similar population or a similar structure, but because their location. And we often have residents who say, hey, if I move to Delhi, this is what I would pay. So this gives you kind of a range of where we are. We're kind of in that middle range. But when you start to look at full service cities, we're actually at the lower end of some of the other communities. The challenge we have that we've talked about in the past is that Ingham County is a pretty high taxed county. In fact, they vary between Ingham County and Wayne County is the highest average tax county in the state. And the reason for that is there's multiple, there's pros and cons, right? I mean, you live in a community that we're adjacent to a lot of government offices. close to MSU. These are all things that provide great employment for a lot of our residents, but a lot of those do not pay taxes, right? Those state facilities. And so what that means is the negative of that is the rest of our property tax owners or property owners have to spread those taxes and those costs amongst them, which means they're going to be generally at a higher rate than other counties in the state that don't have all of those facilities. So when we look at where our dollar goes, and when you pay a tax dollar for the city of Mason, where is it going? Because this is often the challenge. People come in and they pay their tax bill and they think the entire amount of money is going to the city. So for a residential home, 29 cents of every dollar is going to the city of Mason. For commercial, it's 22. And so we're talking about, as you start to look at those cents, how does that compare with other things that you pay for? And we pulled up some numbers. And so the average monthly bill for their taxes is around $84 for the average home. But if you compare that to energy costs or cable or data, all the things that we view as essential services that are being provided, the average Michigan resident pays about $160 per month for their gas and electric. The average household in 2020 paid about $217 in cable and internet per month. The average family paid in their cell phone plan about $120, and the average consumer, this was 2020, so I'm interested to see if this holds true, but in entertainment, $281 per month. So these are things that, you know, when we talk about essential services, I think it's really important, and we talk about this a lot internally, that our essential services, we are providing a value. We're providing parks, trails, cemetery, forestry, police, fire, clean streets, sidewalks, lighting, maintenance, snow removal, all of these things that really make a community a place you want to live. And so there is a value to that. And I think we're doing a pretty efficient service for what our residents get as a value. So I was going to jump into process, but I want to make sure there aren't any questions on those trends or that data that was provided. Okay, so I want to jump into process and talk about kind of our whole process, which you've seen this slide a couple times now. You're going to keep seeing it whenever we do these things of where we are in our process, and we are in the budget stage. And so I just want to remind everyone that there's a reason why this is the process, because as a staff, we have to provide a budget that's based off of a CIP, that's based off of other plans that you've adopted, that's based off of the master plan. It all kind of leads into, you know, and meeting all of our city ordinances and our city charter. We have to follow that trend in order to get you the document that you can review and know that the city staff is following your direction from those plans that you've already adopted. So we're at the stage of funding, right? So we've talked about the capital improvement program. Hopefully in the future, it will be a little more separated from the budget, but that's really the prioritization of the capital. And then the budget is how does it all fit together with the operational costs and the revenue that we have. So where we are in the actual budget process is that our leadership team has spent a lot of time prioritizing and presenting operational changes and projections for the current year, as well as revenue constraints and projections for the future year. And so we've done a lot of that figuring out and talking between departments, especially the general fund is the most challenging because there's multiple departments using the same revenue, that we really had to kind of maneuver a lot of those things and figure out what is COVID's long-term impacts on us, or at least the next year. So what you're seeing today is our staff presentation of the budget. This must occur before the first regular meeting in April. So we'd like to do it a little bit before then, but that is our ultimate, kind of roadblock from a charter perspective. And then the next step following this is staff clarifications. There's going to be questions and things that maybe we notice. I know some of you have already shared some typos with me, which I appreciate, and we will make sure the updated version has those corrected. And then you will do a budget hearing before the adoption, and then the adoption has to happen no later than the third Monday in May. That's all charter driven as part of the process. So when we talk about how we develop a budget for you to consider, we really look at a couple different things. We have that required process, which we just talked about, that has those deadlines. But then we also talk about how can we provide you with the best information. And so that was the switch we made when we did multi-year budgeting. Because we know that multi-year budgeting helps you get a better understanding of the financial position, our revenue and our cost drivers, those trends that we're seeing. It also gives an opportunity to have a strategic response. We're going to talk about that a lot today. I think that the multi-year budgeting and the capital CIP being a real document that we lean on really has given us some ideas of what's coming and what some challenges are. That does not mean we have a financial concern today, but it means we're seeing it coming. What is our plan of attack to address that? I can tell you if we were doing single year budget, you would see no issue today because our budget today is fine. But what we do see is a trend that we're going to talk about that we want to be able to be proactive in addressing. We also really are focused on long-term sustainability. And when I say that, I can tell you sustainability is getting a bad rap lately when you talk to a lot of people, because sustainability, what does that really mean? It just sounds good. What I mean by sustainable is that we have a long-term plan to regularly replace equipment, maintain the property that we have, and ensure that we can provide the services that our residents expect. Those are things that are those essential core services, but also maintaining the property in the way we should so that we don't get into this deferred maintenance challenge that we're facing now with some of our other buildings. But also, we've done some great things when it comes to roads and things like that, where we've ensured that we haven't gotten behind. A lot of communities, those things are starting to pile up in a way that's really difficult for them to get a proactive plan about. So we really have done a lot of that work already with streets and some other things. We just have to do a little bit more with our properties and our assets. So when I present a budget, we're doing it based on a couple of things. One is we have a commitment to a balanced budget. That's required. We have to provide you with a balanced budget. It meets all of our legal and fiscal requirements, that all of our basic services are maintained and funded adequately, that our program services will be efficient, that we're making sure that we're trying to save costs where we can and get creative on providing those services in the most efficient way, that it's based on an accurate CIP and based on adopted plans. You're going to see some recommendations we have regarding parks, and that's specifically based on the adopted Parks and Rec plan. And so we have to lean on those. Those are things that you've adopted that really drive how we lay out the budget. The proprietary funds are self-sufficient. Those funds need to be not something that the general fund is subsidizing, but that the users are paying for the actual cost of that fund. And then our revenues are realistic and conservative. We could provide you a budget that has a percentage increase of revenues of 6-7%. That wouldn't be accurate, but it may make it look better. So our focus is that those revenues have to be conservative and accurate. So we also do it with the box of where we want to be on a fund balance perspective. So we've talked about this previously, and this is kind of the area that we focus on when we're looking at the budget. Is our goal for our general fund balance is about 20%. Best practice is 16%, but City of Mason has a little bit more advantage because of our fiscal year, that we know if we're trending negatively very quickly. We can make adjustments in capital. And so a 20% fund balance is a little bit more. It doesn't get you up to that 35, but best practice, like we said, is 16. And so 20% is our goal. Maximum fund balance is 35%. And the reason we say that that's a maximum that we're holding, and when I say we're holding 35%, it means that there's not an intended capital that's coming up, that we're keeping that fund balance for, that we know and we're planning for. If we know that we have those things funded, then our goal is to fully fund pensions and OPEBs, to move up our debt schedule wherever we can, and to pre-fund or accelerate capital improvements that are in the CIP. If we had the great problem that some cities are having right now with recovery dollars, where, hey, I have $50 million that I don't know what to do with, our strategy, if we were in that place, would be to tee up all of our capital that would be eligible and move it up in a more expedited way. We also would obviously evaluate reducing the millage rate if we were ever in that situation. We are not. And so if we were, though, that would be one of the priorities that we would make. So I want to talk a little bit about the budget roadmap. This is always a little helpful for me to make sure that we're staying on track with where we're seeing the vision of the budget going. And I just want to remind you, I came on in 16, 17, and at that time we were doing single year budgets, and the CIP was really kind of a separate process. It was definitely more of a wish list than an actual goal for capital, and they weren't connected as well as they should be. And so we really took that year to just observe. No changes, really assessment of the funding and organization, and really identifying what the base level of service that was the expectation of the community was. So in 17, 18, we worked hard to get a realistic CIP and implemented multi-year budgeting. We really wanted to provide the resources so that a decision could be made, which we recommended a tax increase because we could see the trend that we couldn't maintain the basic level of services that we've already, were expected with the revenue that we had. We also wanted to make sure we had proper staffing allocation. So we did a little bit of switching around. We added some part-time staff. That's when we added the customer service desk to eliminate all the folks that were having their own customer response, so that we could combine that into 2 positions so that the other folks could prioritize their work. In 18, 19, we really focused on enhancing technology, services, and refining plans. That's when we started doing some more online stuff. We worked on our website. We did some other things, transitioning some of those applications to online. Is it perfect? No. Can we always improve? Yes, but we did make some big strides in that year to try to get some things online. We also really focused on a strategy for large capital. That's really when we started figuring out what was our plan for DPW and the wastewater treatment plant and the library. Really, that was all those projects I was told when I came on were projects that we just could not get over the hump. We needed to do, but we just couldn't get to the step of actually implementing. We also really talked about a strategy for unfunded liabilities. Internally, we really worked hard to try to identify where we could have some impacts on contracts that had minimal impact to employees immediately, but maybe over time would have a long-term impact to our liability. And so we created a strategy that we had to implement over the course of a couple years as we negotiated those contracts. And so in 1920, we started implementing some of those things, which I'll talk a little bit about. We also really completed plans for our investment strategy. That was our park plan. Instead of just talking about our facilities not being where they needed to be, we really outlined a plan that had action items that were based on prioritization that the community was driving to help us lead our CIP. And then we had spring hit, where COVID really put everything on hold, and we were really getting excited to start making some of those investments, but we had to pause as so many things had to pause during that time frame. Everything from getting contractors to permits and things like that were a challenge. So this last year, we're still really on hold, right? And if you guys remember the last budget we approved, it was status quo. Let's not do a lot. Let's just do the minimum we need to do to get through this year. We weren't replacing staff at that time. We weren't really sure the impacts of COVID. And so we were just kind of pausing. And so we still were negotiating contracts in that time frame, and we were still making sure they reflected those OPEB and pension strategies in order to reduce our liability. And we also used that time to really confirm our strategy when it came to large capital, really lining up our timeline for DPW, wastewater treatment plant, and the library, really teeing up grant applications and things like that, starting to meet with some of our state partners to make sure that we teed up those projects in the best way. So the budget that I'm proposing this year is really about minimizing the long-term impacts of COVID. This is the time that we need to invest in our infrastructure and our facilities. The communities that do that at this time are the ones that are going to be successful long-term. You saw that in 2008 and other economic constrictions. We need to be not losing the opportunity and getting further behind, because the impact to the city will likely be more of a long tail impact. We don't want to be 3 years from now having an impact of COVID and not being able to replace a vehicle when we delayed them this year, for example. So we really also need to focus on stabilizing the water and sewer funding. This is not a surprise to any of you. We knew that rates were going to have to be evaluated, and we'll talk a little bit about why that got delayed and what our strategy is when it comes to rates moving forward. We also need to start those long-term investments. So the next year will be focused on DPW and design for the wastewater treatment plant, which we'll talk about that too. I also wanted to give you kind of a preview of what's coming, because in the next 2 years, I think we have to stay focused on continuing to expand and grow on that bigger picture. So the following year, long-term investments, wastewater treatment plant, and really implementing some of those long-term adaptation strategies in the master plan. We're going to spend a lot of time this year focusing on that, but we need to make sure we complete it the following year with zoning and ordinance updates that we need to do. And then also stabilizing our capital funding, which is really that park funding. I want to make sure we have a good strategy for that. We're going to show you some trends that are concerning, but I think we can address that in 2022 and 2023 in a way that really provides community input and really gives you guys the confidence that whatever direction you move, you feel confident that the community is behind you in it. In 23, 24, we're going to have a lot of our large capital complete. We're going to have really, that library to the point where it's accessible. We're going to have the DPW facility, the wastewater treatment plant. Now it's going to be about asset management and really maintaining that for the next 20 years, which gets me really excited because I think we're setting up the community for a great sustainable future. And by sustainable, I mean one that can be maintained with a reasonable millage rate and still providing the core services that our community expects. So when we talk about budget roadmap, I can tell you one of the things that starts to get us nervous internally is we got a lot going on in the next couple of years. And in this timing, there are about 50 steps under each of these items, but I wanted to just give you kind of a picture of how these things are going to tee up. So we're looking at the master plan. You're already kind of engaged in that process. That's going to be really taking full stride going into next fiscal year and getting completed into next fiscal year. We're going to start those zoning updates. So there's going to be a lot of policy work and then finishing up the subplans and fully implementing any ordinances. When we talk about the library, we've talked about that a little bit. Designing that first floor, that was completed this last year. Construction of the highest impact started, which is phase 1, part 1. Complete phase 1, part 1 in the following year and start fundraising for the next phase and hopefully move forward with that completion of at least the first floor in this time period. City Hall, we talked a little bit about that, designing that first floor, highest impact construction started, hold on everything else. And so once we know what that highest impact cost is, that would obviously reduce any cost or whatever that number is. We're going to really focus on that highest impact. On DPW, we're starting the design, we're finalizing that. We'll talk a little bit about how that's going. And then we'll be working on financing next fiscal year. We have already started teeing that up. And then construction will start in the following spring. Wastewater treatment plant will be starting design next fiscal year and then kind of moving that same trend as the DPW just 1 year out. And then Rainer Park, we're talking about really designing that master plan, fundraising for the playground and playground construction that following summer. So when you start seeing this is a lot of staff capacity that is going to be taken up in these large capital projects. I can tell you it makes me nervous from a capacity perspective, but we're really excited to move on these projects and we think they're ready to go. And we think we have the financing plan in place and the ability to really make it successful in the future. So I know I just talked a lot about process and kind of that trend. Is there any questions on that? I can't see all of you, so if you do, just speak up because it's a really small table for me to see. Okay, so now we're going to get into budget detail. This is the meat of the budget presentation, and I want to make sure we take our time and go through this so you really understand the impacts and what we're proposing in the budget. So first conversation I want to have is about the impact of COVID. I talked a little bit about this previously, but when we talk about the impacts of COVID, we did get some grant funds. Some of that grant fund really supplemented the statutory or the revenue sharing that the state was proposing would have given us anyway in normal times, but some of it was in addition. We were able to implement some programs like the Workshare program that really saved the city money. We obviously held off on hiring seasonal staff. We held off on any replacements. We just started doing replacements this last month. Otherwise, we didn't replace anybody over the last year that had left. And then we have the American Recovery Act that was recently passed. There are no final numbers on this. I know you've probably seen some estimates. They're not accurate. We've been told this over and over again, that they're still finalizing those numbers. But we anticipate we're going to be around 800,000 in funding, and that'll be split between 2 years. And it's not in our budget currently. So know that that 800,000 is not anticipated in our budget yet. One, we wanted to make sure we were on the same track as you as far as wanting to prioritize where we thought. But two, that we don't have the money yet and we don't know the final number. So we don't put things in our budget until we know it's something that's a very high likely and when it's going to land. So that'll be something that we'll adjust once we get a good indication. We are applying for all grants and loan funds that we can for CIP projects. One of the things I'm most proud about with our CIP is that it's really easy to apply for grants when you have a CIP that's realistic, because it takes a lot of staff time. I'm not saying that, but it's easy to see, okay, there's more money coming into this program. What do we have that's potentially eligible? And we're applying for things, you know, we're applying for the Rainer grant, Rainer Playground. We did not get funding last time. We were off, I think in sequence, maybe by 10 or 15 of the communities that applied. But the reality is they might get additional funds, and it's worth it to apply again because we might move up in that prioritization. So we want to make sure we have those grants applications ready. I can tell you it does take a lot of staff time, and a lot of that time is happening after hours because we're doing our normal jobs otherwise. So when you talk about the Recovery Act, we know that more money is going to be flowing into certain areas. The Recovery Act is restricted to 4 uses. So it's lost revenue, water, sewer, or broadband, and it is currently an or. There is some debate of whether there's going to be some clarification of whether that can be an and, but currently the interpretation is it's an or, so you pick one category. Business assistance, those that had an impact by COVID, and premium pay for essential workers. So when you start looking at these categories, for us, it's pretty easy because you start looking at lost revenue, and we have over $450,000 in lost revenue that we believe would be eligible. $375,000 is in the water sewer fund alone. And so those are funds that we anticipated receiving, but COVID impacts, whether that's less water usage or things like that, had an impact on those revenues. Then you move to the next category, which is water, sewer, and broadband. We picked water just because we have some pretty straightforward projects in water, but sewer would also be an eligible category. And we have over 810,000 in water in the next CIP alone when you start looking at the eligible projects. We have some water, and we have a water tower work in the current fiscal year that would be eligible as well. That's a pretty high cost item. So we have enough eligible activities in these 2 categories to spend the funding that we anticipate getting. I know it can be confusing because when you see the media reports and the press on the American Recovery Act, you'll hear people say, and you'll hear the MML say things like, this is the time to be creative. This is the time to look at new programs. This is the time to do all kinds of things that maybe you've always wanted to do that are on your wish list. That's likely feasible for a lot of communities. When you look at what Lansing is estimated at getting in East Lansing, they can get really creative within these constraints. So East Lansing is expected to get around $12 million. Lansing is expected to get around $51 million. Ingham County is expected to get around $57 million. So these are big chunks of money based on population that they will be able to prioritize in the way that they see fit. So you're going to see things I would expect like business incentive programs and things like that in some of these jurisdictions that have a lot of money that they have to spend in a short period of time. We unfortunately do not have that luxury, and that's why we're recommending covering lost revenue, which was the priority of the Recovery Act. And then 2, really investing in our infrastructure to hopefully limit the impacts of the increase that is going to be necessary. So ensuring that we're not causing a greater increase than we expected with the infrastructure projects that we have. When we talk about personnel, we've stayed steady at the 46, and we're recommending staying at that. We feel like that's an essential, that's a good core group of people, and that keeps us in that under 50 range of full-time, which really creates some savings for us when it comes to healthcare and some other things. But we also feel like we have a pretty good handle on essential services. We do need to get creative in getting some support in different ways. So you're going to see some things that we'll highlight in some of the other categories. For example, in my category, there is some money set aside for a fellowship, for us to apply for a fellowship, for a college student to come in their master's program, to come in and help in the manager's office, implementing some of these programs and understanding some of that. It's a low cost way to get some expertise that really can drive with some projects. And after talking with some other communities, they really found that to be a really beneficial addition. We don't have any leads on anybody, but we wanted to make sure we had an allocation if we could track someone down. You know, in community development, they've identified an intern and really wanting to make sure they continue to have interns to help supplement some of the work we have to do. So we're trying to find creative ways that don't increase the cost on liabilities or OPEBs or things like that, but still provide us with some extra manpower and hours to help us get through some of these humps of some pretty time-intensive capital and grant projects. We do have an increase in part-time hours that's specifically related to us kind of switching around some positions, and that includes adding the permit specialist position. It's a part-time position where we shifted a current part-time individual into this role where their focus is only on processing permits, everything from getting, reviewed and getting them out the door quickly so that we can increase that turnaround time. Our union employees are all, they're under contract. They have a built-in increase that's 2%. And then the non-union, we have that matching with the 2% increase as well. With all the staffing changes, including this changes above, the overall costs are up by $56,000, which is about 2% from the last year budget amount. So keep in mind, we didn't fill all the positions, so the projections are quite less than that because we had a lot of positions we left open, or they had a little bit of work share time in the current fiscal year, which meant they had reduced hours. And so this is from budget to budget actual plan staff. So I wanted to talk a little bit about pension and OPEB liability. So when we talk about these two items, these are the things that people start to get really nervous about. And I want to make sure you know that internally we have a really strong strategy on how to address them. We've really, over the last few union contracts, negotiated things like the reduction in multipliers, freezing COLA, really making sure that we are reducing small things like vacation time carryover and payouts so that that doesn't increase our long-term liability. We want people to use their vacation versus carry it over. Increased employees' contribution, just a small amount, and we also increased our contribution, and we did more voluntary contributions each year to try to reduce that or increase that funded percentage. We also have made some really targeted strategies at the OPEBs as well. We really are making sure that we're limiting who has access to those, and that we're really still evaluating if there's more cost-effective ways we can provide that benefit to still save money. It's always challenging when you're dealing with retirees because they don't like change, and we don't want to disrupt them. But on the other hand, if there's a way that we can still provide them a great service at a reduced cost, we are evaluating all options. So when we talk about the actual percentages, when you look at our funding, we are at 65% as of December 31st, 2019. Our next actuarial will be for December 31st, 2020, but we'll receive it in June, so we'll get an idea of where we're at. We have a new MERS report that allows us to separate contributions for retirees and that liability versus active employees. So you're going to see some changes in the budget, specifically in fringe benefits, where they've been shifted into a retiree category out of the individual departments. So you're going to see a lot of reductions in the individual departments, but then you're going to see a big jump in the general fund at the end, where that's where all the retirees are. The overall costs have not changed, but it shows you kind of a better picture of what we're paying for. So when you're seeing this, we're recommending an increase in contributions. And overall contribution is over about 11%. Our goal here is to keep chipping away and getting to a higher percentage of funded. On OPEBs, we've made a lot of really significant changes that have helped us in our funding and also contributions. So we're now at 50% funded as of June 30th, 2020. The next actuarial won't be until 22-23 fiscal year, but we're really targeted this and making sure that we're making good progress. We're in really good shape compared to what the state's goals are versus where we are. But obviously we want to get to a higher percentage of funded so that this is not an area of liability for the city. The challenges with these plans is the actuarials can change. And I can tell you on our city manager listserv, everyone kind of holds their breath to see how MERS is going to evaluate things. And, you know, small changes to their actuarial can make a big change in our funding percentage. If they anticipate people are going to live longer, if they anticipate different cost dynamics and things like that, that all can impact our funding without us making any changes at all as far as our contribution. So we constantly are watching that, but know that we only have so much that's within our control. So I was going to go into next detail by fund. Those were more overall kind of personnel liabilities and COVID questions. Is there anything related to that before we get into general fund?
Deb, I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm looking in the budget narrative because I'm following along with the PowerPoint. On the page that says impacts of COVID, there is a table that shows that essentially we're approximately $460,000 in lost revenue. I'm just trying to make sense of the methodology for how you guys calculated that, because I'm not quite getting where you got that high of a lost revenue from.
So it's the 370 plus the 84.
But I just meant, like, if we were just to take, community room rentals. So we're estimating that lost revenue due to COVID is just over $11,000. So I'm seeing obviously in 20 that, our revenue went down about $5,000. And then if you add in what we would have presumed to have gotten in this year, that doesn't really quite match up. So I'm just trying to figure out what I'm missing. I think it was actually like 12,000 when I looked at that.
Well, if you, and Michelle, I know you're on the line who ran some of these numbers, but there's a specific actual calculation that they require you to go through as far as looking at a certain fiscal year and then basing it off of that fiscal year and then the decrease in projections. And I think it also allows you to do a slight increase over that time. But Michelle, I don't know if you can speak to that more of that calculation, but I know it's actually spelled out in the act.
Yeah, so we just took some trends. So we used 17 and 18 fiscal years. And then as you can see, 1920 have lower amounts. So 1920 is what we received. And then 2021, those 2 years is what we got to the total. So for water, it's a little different because for revenues for water and sewer, we took our projections, what we expected to, end the year with, and then we're basing it on actuals to date right now.
So we're looking at trends then basically from fiscal year 18 through the current year to figure out what our impact is.
Well, you're actually, if I'm hearing you right, Michelle, you're looking at 17-18 to 18-19 to see if there was any trend of an increase, and then you're following that trend into 19-20, 20-21, and across those 2 years, what is the loss of that trend going up?
Correct. Yep. You have to add the last 2 years because COVID affects last fiscal year plus this current fiscal year.
So you'd be
Okay.
basically calculating a percentage increase that was between 17, 18, and 18, 19 as your trend. And then working out through there. We know that some of these items may be questioned. And so we put in everything that we felt we had the best argument were true lost revenues. We actually had more items than this, but we removed a couple things that we thought would be a hard justification. For example, like school our police officers helping the school, like at football games and things like that. Well, it's overtime generally. So is that really lost revenue? Because we also have lost expenses. So we remove that. Some communities are putting those kinds of things forward, but we know we have enough infrastructure dollars to backfill anything that is not covered in the lost revenue.
So it's a conservative estimate based on the formula included in the act, and our actual lost revenue could very well be a little bit higher if we were to
Correct.
be more generous in our categorization of it.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. No, that's very helpful. Thanks.
And obviously you can see in that chart, the biggest impact is to our water and sewer income. And that's the challenge that, we want to try to limit the impacts of a rate increase based on that lost revenue. So we wanted to make sure we prioritize the lost revenue there first. Any other
That's all I
questions?
had.
Okay. Rita, I'm sorry, Councilmember Vogel.
Thanks. So kind of it echoes Marlon. So it's the 375, give or take, plus 84,000 that was lost revenues. And that gives us the 370 plus 84. Never mind. I got it. I'm tracking.
Okay.
Thanks, Marlon. All right. Thanks, Deb.
Yep. Any other questions? Okay. All right, so we're gonna move into going detail by fund. So we're gonna start with general fund and kind of talk about the general fund overall. And then we'll go into specifics by department so we can talk about the specific changes. So when we talk about the general fund overall, again, I want to remind you that this does not include those federal funds, any federal funds that would be coming into the general fund, which my majority of them are going in the water sewer fund, but it doesn't reflect that. And it also reflects an increase that we're seeing of about 3.7 in value, which increases our mill value to 236,000. That's on actual values that we're seeing come in. So we feel good about those numbers. We also have anticipated revenue sharing in here. And again, that goal of being in that 20 to 35% range. 18% is kind of the gold standard in what you can strive for, but we're aiming for that 20,000 or 20%. So some of the capital trends that we are seeing that start to make us a little concerned is when we start to look at, we have a pretty heavy capital year coming up, and it's catching up of some things over the last 2 years. We want to make sure we use those funds and invest them appropriately so that we have that long-term investment, regular replacement of equipment, taking care of our buildings and facilities, and providing those core services. But what we're seeing is that once we even out that fund balance, we're going to get to a point where we only have about 50,000 annually to spend on capital that's not funded by other resources. And I say that because we know that capital, oh, I missed that. Get back to that slide. We know that a lot of our capital projects are appealing for some grant revenue, and there may be times that we can get additional funding, but we need to be projecting in the way that, realistically, we have about 50,000 in capital. And you think about capital projects, really think about that last category in the CIP combined with parks, non-motorized, and cemetery. That's really general fund capital that we'd be looking at. So we have a lot in that category, in those two categories, especially with our improvements to parks. And so when you look at parks in particular, we've been leaning on the Rayner Bond Fund, which I think is appropriate because it's funding that was set aside for this purpose. But when we start looking at the anticipated capital expenditures and where Rayner Bond Fund gets us, it's going to run out fairly quickly. We're going to be looking at 3 years out that we're not going to have that capital from Rayner Bond, and we're going to start to be a little bit short even in 22 or 21, 22. So when we start to think about that, we see what's coming. We see that, if we want to follow the Parks and Recreation Plan and really strive to improve our parks on a regular basis, that capital that we need may have to come from another source. And so we got to think about what does that look like? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a future slide. But I just want to emphasize that this is why multi-year budgeting is important. We can see a trend 2-3 years out, and we can see what's coming and be able to prepare for it or adjust as needed. So we get into budget detail. I want to go through by category. I'm just going to highlight some of the key points that look a little different. Majority of our operation is staying pretty steady. We've already identified our core-based services, what we need to staff those. So I'm just going to highlight some things that may look a little bit different. So for council, you're going to see operationally, there's an increase in 10,000 for a study. That's a cost allocation plan. This is required by our auditors to do every 5 to 7 years. We haven't done one since 2006. What's making this a high priority is we really need it to cover our cost allocation for the DPW building. We really need to ensure that we're accounting for that properly, of how much should the general fund contribute versus how much should other funds contribute. So that's something we have to do this year as a priority, moving into that financing for the DPW. In the managers category, I mentioned we're trying to do some creative things like potentially having a fellowship intern. That may or may not happen. It all depends on if we have applicants and those that are in the program that get matched with the city. But this allows us a low cost way to get some extra expertise and help to get some of these projects over the hump, including applying for grants and things like that. Assessing, there's no significant changes. The clerk's department, you've already seen their CIP proposal, which is our Laserfiche upgrade, which is our document electronic storage for our materials. We're at a point where we're no longer serviced in our old form. And so we have to move forward with this upgrade. Board of Review, there's no significant changes from the budget. Treasurer and Finance, what you're going to see, and this is what I mentioned before, is that MERS reallocation. You're going to see some decreases in a lot of our individual departments, but you're going to see an overall increase at the end where all of our retirees are. We also have a salary increase in here because we're going to fill our vacant bookkeeper position. This position previously was filled by a spot that was covered half-time in the city manager's office. It was a project specialist, and half-time in the finance department as a bookkeeper. What we found is that we really have to be thinking more keenly on succession planning in our finance department. And we're going to be in a time here where we really need we need someone that can back up those other positions. And also get trained to eventually move into those positions in the near term. And so that's why we're trying to get creative with the fellowship intern to help with some of those special projects while allowing this bookkeeper to be positioned to be backfilled and trained to move into those positions. This is not a new position. This bookkeeper position was there previously, but we tried the half-time and it just wasn't meeting the needs of the finance department. Under buildings and grounds, these are things that we've talked a little bit about, which is the parking lot repairs, the furniture replacement, and the phase 1 and carpet replacement. Will make the adjustments that were identified in the previous discussion. So the next category under general fund, this has some, we don't have significant changes in budget on legal, property, and legal is so up and down depending on the year and what we're doing from a case perspective. So we're maintaining the same budget item, our budget amount. On property, we have a slight decrease because the Temple Street assessment has ended. And so the city has paid off the final payment in that. Forestry, there's no significant change. Cemetery, there's a decrease because of the MERS allocation, but no other changes. In police administration, again, a decrease because of that MERS allocation. And you've seen the proposed CIP interview digital recording system, which is the 15,000. Crossing guards and police patrolling, no significant changes from budget. I will say it was really challenging this year to give you good comparables because crossing guards are a great example. It's been such a strange year that it's hard to compare and give you an accurate reflection of what the costs are of that. So we're basing it really, we're going back 2 years and kind of figuring out the trends. So we knew going into this budget presentation that you wanted to move out the rescue boat and motor. So we have crossed this out here, but it's not been reflected yet in the budget. We will make sure we make that change in the updated, but this gives you the other fire department items that were slated on the CIP that were moved forward. On the community development, we had the master plan originally planned for the current year at 125, but we actually split it between 2 years to more accurately reflect how that plan will actually progress. Obviously, we're going to start it this year, but majority of it will be in next fiscal year. We did do a reallocation of staff hours between community development and the building inspection fund. This is where we talked about with that permit specialist versus admin support and kind of shifting some of those positions a little bit to get the biggest impact, but using part-time positions so that we're not increasing our overall costs. All the other categories did not have any significant changes on the slide except for our standard contract increase for waste with Granger, which is a 3% increase. I always like to remind people that when we negotiated that contract, we did a longer contract, but it ensured that we would have free recycling and free yard waste removal as part of that contract with no additional cost. And so we do have a longer increase our contract with them, but we were able to negotiate those items that other cities are paying significantly for. So when we look at our budget for parks and ball diamonds, this is the area that I think we need to have that greater conversation about where we're headed with park investments. So right now, what we have in the next fiscal year is the Riverwalk Trail evaluation and repair. This was the highest ranked item in our park and rec plan. Our community and our residents love the trail and they want it to be at a condition where they can easily walk on it. I often get calls, especially from folks that are in wheelchairs or in walkers, that right now there's some significant needs to improve some certain areas where roots have popped on the trail. So that's going to be a priority this year. Rainier Park improvements. We have $350,000 identified here without any grant funds. So that's the city's contribution. If we are successful in getting the funding from the state, based on their requirements and the additional items you have to add to the project, the total project cost increased to $485,000, but we would only be putting in $242,000 from the city because it would be a 50% match. So we'd be putting less than our 350 allocated, but the project would be a little bit bigger than what we anticipated in our original budget. We also have the Lee Austin Park improvement designs, which are funded by the DDA. So it's not in this category, but I wanted to make sure we identified it because I think most people would think it would be here, but that's actually been shifted to the DDA. So I want to remind you that we prioritize these projects based on the plan that was focused on bringing 100% of our facilities into a state of good repair within 10 years and ensuring 100% of our neighborhoods have non-motorized connectivity to facilities within 10 years by connecting sidewalks and trails where there are gaps between parks. So when we talk about the Columbia Cross area, that was a really key part of that goal 1B. How do we connect our neighborhoods to our parks? We hope that MDOT will sign off on it, but if they don't, we're going to have to figure out a different plan and try to get those people across. Projects are always evaluated based on compliance, things like ADA, condition of the current facility, capacity, and our cost to do the work, and also community input. So right now, we're going through that plan based on those priorities. But where we see is the trend of capital coming up, we don't have any revenue to support it, which we knew when looking at the park plan that there is support for a millage or some type of revenue to invest in the parks. What I would like to propose and would want to discuss with the council is that we have enough time where we could potentially even send this for a vote of the people. We don't require to do it, but we could do a vote with, we actually now have a very strategic plan on capital and the cost that it's going to take over the next few years. And so we could go to the public with a plan that would say, for example, I'm not saying this is what it would be, but for example, we need this many mills for the next 10 years to address all of the capital identified in this plan. That would allow us to really give a concrete proposal that they could consider and give a roadmap. I'd like staff to spend a little more time on what that might look like and make some recommendations to you. But if that's something that you're interested in, that would be the recommendation I would make, because it really allows the public to be a partner to determine whether they want to invest in the parks or not. So the next item on this category, in this area is the library, and we talked a lot about this during the capital, but this kind of outlines that breakdown of making sure that 50%, kind of the expectations were that the estimated cost was $225 and the city would contribute no more than 50% and no funds would be expended until the deed was cleared. And so we've been diligently working on that. And I think we've checked all of these boxes except for the school, which they plan to vote in the next month and have given us an indication that they plan to clear the deed. And so I think we've checked these boxes to move forward with the library plan. I know there was a lot of confusion during the CIP, so I thought it might help to show you some renderings. So phase 1 is the first floor. This is what the first floor would look like at the completion of phase 1. It would allow for movement of the children's area, access for the ramp, addressing plumbing, mechanical, electrical, and really allowing this space in here where the reading room is to be flexible, movable space where they can have programming like they normally do in the basement. So it would be all ADA accessible. So when we look at phase 1, part 1, it's going to be hard to see here, but the hash going this direction is part 1. So this is an ADA bathroom here. This is the entrance and the ramp, fireplace, and the circulation desk, which is funded by the library, will all be done in this phase 1, part 1. That will be kind of the first step. And then the next step will be reconfiguring the children's area and the adult area and doing some of that shifting. So when we look at the rest of the categories, there's not a lot of changes. Nothing that's really significant except for that MERS reallocation and the retiree benefits. We do have that contingency category. There's no significant changes, but that's our voluntary payments to MERS and OPEBs. So that just kind of tracks that for you to see how we're contributing. And then transfers out decrease from this budget because we had a major street fund balance. So we didn't need to transfer out as much of our general fund to fund those projects. So before I move on to special revenue funds, are there any questions with the general fund?
Deb?
I have a boatload of them, but they won't be tonight.
Deb?
Yeah.
In your descriptions here, like on slide 37 and whatnot, where you say no significant change from budget. Are you saying no significant change from last year's budget? I don't understand the reference.
So what we're saying is that when you look at the costs that are proposals, so let me give you an example. So there's obviously some inflation increases and things like that, but when we say no significant changes, there's no major capital, there's no operational changes in staffing, these are just routine increases. There's no big changes in operations. So you're going to see a lot of decreases in like the MERS, for example, that show a number change, but it's not changing any people or any cost. That's just an accounting shift. It's not necessarily the number. So what we were trying to identify for you were, are there anything that's major capital or operational with staff changes? Like, are we adding a position? So for example, in my area, we're adding some funding under contract services for the fellowship. But otherwise, all the other items are in line with just normal cost increases or things like that. There's nothing that's out of the ordinary.
So it's no significant change from last year's budget.
But generally, yes, unless we knew that we weren't filling a position, there might have been a little bit less in the projection budget.
The statement's confusing. It should, you're saying there's no significant change from the projected budget for 2021.
From the actual budget, you're right, from the actual budget.
For 2021, there's no significant change, then it makes perfect sense.
Yes, that would be an accurate statement. I didn't mean to confuse it. Where we were trying to avoid the confusion was on the projections. That's where there was some slight changes because of the COVID.
Yep, sure.
And for those of you that have seen these budget presentations before, which I think all of you have, we would normally compare it to the projection. So that's why this year is a little bit different. We would normally say, where is the projection landing versus what are we budgeting for the next year? there any other questions on the general fund?
Deb, I have two briefly.
Sure.
The first one is on slide 33. If you can go back to that, just so we can all see it. The cash on hand and then percent of expenditures. If you could just help me understand how that's calculated, because I was just looking at it straight, taking the 1.6 million as a percentage of the expenditures for 22, the 7.9 million, and I got less than the 24% that we're projected to have. So I'm just trying to figure out how we get to the 24%.
Michelle, can I lean on you on that one?
Yeah, so we do the cash on hand divided by our operational expenses. So if you look at the spreadsheets under your general fund tab, I have it broke out operational expenses versus capital, because capital can be stopped at any time.
Okay. Now that makes sense. So then that was my error, just taking it straight out of the 7.9. It's actually a different figure there. So that makes complete sense.
But to piggyback on Marlon, then this chart should be changed because it's completely misleading. You need to clarify that. That 24% has to relate to the 1.6 related to whatever it's related to. The numbers have to match. I mean, if this is a public document that people are going to read, that Marlon picked up on something that normally I would pick up on too, and I missed that one. I would hope we could get that straightened out. I'm not sure I still understand what Michelle just said, although I completely believe her to be completely accurate, but the chart itself should be conveying numbers that make sense as you read down through the chart.
We can make that change.
And then the other clarification question that I have was regarding the cost allocation study. I know you mentioned that this was required via our audit, and that it's primarily targeted toward looking at DPW staff. Just for my own edification, this would be cost allocation for all city staff?
Yeah, just to be clear, we're required to do the cost allocation no matter what. And it's just so that's that. But we would also have been required to provide it for the DPW financing to determine how we should allocate cost of that facility. And so because we're doing them within a very short time frame, at the same timing of when it would be appropriate for the DPW, we wouldn't have to do an additional one. So it's allowing us to use the same data. But it's for the citywide. It's not just for DPW.
So do you anticipate that there might be significant changes into how staff time is billed across the board?
I don't know, Michelle. I know it's been a while since we've done a cost allocation, and I think we've tracked some from we track from our staff and their use of equipment and things. I think we have a fairly good idea, but I'll defer to Michelle on how confident she is in the numbers.
Yeah, so what this study is going to do, it'll be two different studies, like Deb had said. One's going to be allocating general fund staffing, like our payables, the budgeting, the HR across all the funds. So all the funds are going to contribute to general fund for those services. So that's part one of the study. And that's the one that the auditors recommend us update every 5 or 7 years. And then part two of this study is going to be an add-on. So it'll be a separate study. And what it's going to look at is the staff and the equipment and the storage space for the DPW facility to be able to get an appropriate cost allocation plan for that new DPW facility. So we're going to kind of run it like a motor vehicle. So it's going to be like an internal service fund, where it's going to charge out all the different funds for the use of the DPW. So it's going to cover operations and that kind of thing. So that's going to be an add-on to the study.
Okay, no, that helps. Thank you so much. And hey, I lied. I've got one more quick one. On the parks plan, so I'm assuming this would be a separate council discussion about how we want to handle any increased revenue to cover, future park maintenance. You mentioned the potential public vote to determine whether or not we have a special millage for that. What's your timeline on bringing that before council?
Well, it's not necessary for the current budget. we don't need to do a millage increase for the current budget. I believe, I think council wants that information as soon as possible, to determine kind of the timeline. And so we're going to be working diligently on what we think that would look like. And, we've talked about what's in the park study. We're following the recommendation of the park study, which was to consider a millage increase, really evaluating what that number would be. And does it include operating or just capital? And so we need to do some work to kind of prioritize that and get a good recommendation to you. And then the determination can be, do you want to do that through a public vote? Do you want to just consider the millage yourself? How do you want to evaluate it? The good news is we have time to allow you to consider a public consideration, and that can drive your future decision makings, because if the public comes back and says, I wouldn't support a millage increase, well, then that shows us prioritization of, from a park perspective, maybe that doesn't become as high of a priority for us and we maintain our core services and that's what we target. Or if it comes back overwhelmingly that there's support for that, that makes it a lot easier to make that millage increase.
But
That makes sense.
we need to do this soon. The Rainer Bond Fund's done. Rainer Bond Fund's done this year. So if we want to do more park capital, we got to have a plan next year. So.
Hey, Deb. So with the parks millage, when you say it's not in this year's budget, you're not talking about this proposed 22-23 budget.
Correct.
This is 21-22.
Well, I mean, 21-22. Yeah, I just want to echo what you said, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to get all of that together quickly and let the people vote as soon as possible. All right.
One thing I'd like to see done, if we're even gonna entertain that, part of the discussion has to be tying that to a charter amendment where that park millage is locked in specifically for park millage and can't be used for anything else.
We can talk about that. I mean, I know we did that with streets, but with parks, it might be more appropriate to do just the classic dedicated millage for a period of time instead of forever, because we really have a capital project thing here, but that's what Deb's got to evaluate and come back to us on and say, do we have an operational deficit or do we have a capital deficit or do we have both? If it's just a capital deficit, we could do a millage increase for say 5 to 10 years and then it's done and we get all the projects done and we're done. And then we go into just maintaining the parks. But you're right, Leon, that's definitely an option, something similar to what we did with streets.
Well, I think it's more palatable to people when they know that if they're paying a tax for a specific reason, that it's going to be used for that specific reason, can't be used for anything else. And so there's no sleight of hand and that kind of stuff. So I think that's a higher selling point. And to your point about, doing it for a specific time period or whatever, you can do it for 10 years, get the projects done, then you got to start all over.
Yeah, and that's the evaluation we got to have. But a dedicated millage can only be used for what it's dedicated to. So it's the same as the charter. So, but yeah, Deb's got to get us the data and the proposal on that.
Any other questions?
Deb, I ask this one all the time, and I guess when you're talking about our retirement liabilities and those kinds of things, and I know you're always looking for ways to aggressively reduce those. And I always wonder, when is it that, and maybe it's because you guys got to protect your own retirements, but in the real world, guaranteed pensions just aren't there anymore. People are hiring into jobs and they're putting their money when they want, where they want, through whether it be a Roth or whatever vehicle. And most generally the employers will sweeten the pot a little bit and say, well, we'll match up to a certain amount, which would actually save us money in the long run. At some point, I think we're going to have to get into that. I've been saying that for years, but nobody, I think it's, like I said, everybody wants to protect their lifelong pension rather than say, okay, well, at some point we've got to bite the bullet and realize that we can't continue to fund this way.
Well, Councilmember Clark, we actually did evaluate that. We evaluated eliminating the current pension that we had for new members, and the cost to do that are actually pretty high. And considering the changes we've made with the multiplier and the eligibility and things like that, we've actually found that our current plan is more financially viable to the city in the current state of if we were to eliminate, because you have to have so many people paying in for a certain period of time. And because we have a 1.5 multiplier, we're not in the situation that we were in previously. I will say this, we're working aggressively to address the OPEB liabilities. When you look at the data for our retirement, the reason that we're having the challenges we're having, obviously there's some market conditions, but in the 90s, there were a lot of enhancements to the pensions and OPEBs that were for existing retirees. The problem with that is they didn't pay anything into the actual payment of those items. So the moment that the city made that decision, you automatically flipped the challenge that we have is trying to fund it. And so our current plans are actually funding pretty well. Where we're seeing the challenge is in our retirees that are already there, which we can't do anything about. I mean, we have to provide them the plans that they were promised. And those are the ones that are really, from a multiplier perspective and a benefit perspective, are really high. We've made majority of the changes when we moved to the C plan and some other things that really are limiting the liability, but we're trying to make small changes like COLA changes, vacation changes that just start to shrink it even more. We're constantly evaluating whether we make that jump. We just financially can't make that jump right now. We have to fund at a certain level.
Well, I understand that. I'm not suggesting that we buy out every employee's retirement program. I'm saying that new hires could come in under a new program that would not cost.
But the moment you do that, you have to fund the others because there's no new people paying into them.
There's a transition cost. And for a city our size, it's huge. If we were a city
Yeah,
of
I
1,000
understand that.
employees, it'd be easier to do, but we're not, so.
Well, and honestly, even the ones that are large, I know Muskegon made a jump and some others made a jump. They are really struggling financially now because the cost to make that transition is so large that it's impacting their ability to even hire people to do the work today. And so that's the I mean, I just want to make sure that you're clear that we are evaluating that, and we're evaluating it on a regular basis to see when is the time that this makes sense. But we actually compared it to our 1.5 multiplier, and right now it doesn't seem, but that doesn't mean that in a couple of years it may be a viable option. We have to constantly be looking at it.
Perhaps, Deb, one of the questions you could answer, and I know partly this is where Leon's coming from, is explain to us why private industry seems to be able to do it, but we can't.
I think they don't have the legacy of the benefits. I mean, because what you're facing is you're paying for a pension without people paying into it anymore. So now the city has to fully expend those costs. And so I know that some have been successful. Some municipalities have been successful at bonding for that transition and some other things. That might be something we want to look at. But when we look at the actual cost, we think we would pay more to switch to a defined contribution.
I guess I'm not gonna, at the risk of sounding argumentative, General Motors has made the switch. That's not a little company. Huge companies, all of the auto industry.
Right.
So for some reason, the private industry's been able to find a way to do it. And I'd be curious to know why they can, but government can't. And I'm sure there's a reason. I'm not questioning you. I just like to know what it is if you ever bump into it or if your research leads you down that path.
Well, I can tell you that in some of our evaluation, I'm happy to provide a more thorough presentation on this, but I think when we evaluate benefits, if you start to decrease pension benefits, for example, you have to pay higher in wage. That is in order to be competitive and to be in line with other communities. When you start paying higher in wage and you start doing a percentage of their wage as an investment, which is what we would have to match, we would actually be paying more than what we're paying with our 1.5 multiplier in a C plan. We looked at those comparisons of, what you're looking, and it is a more upfront cost and less of a spread out cost, but it's actually the reverse that from what you were saying, Mr. Marin, that the smaller communities struggle more than the bigger communities because you have less people paying in.
Well, that's what I said.
Um,
If we were a 1,000 employee city, it'd be easier for us than it is the fact we're 46. But I
Yes.
still would like to know, I fully, and I don't mean to, but this is a question we need to have answered because it's been a bugaboo for mine for years, just like it has been for Larry.
Yep.
Why can private industry make this work and we can't? And I don't want, if it is because of multipliers and because of different systems and whatnot, then explain that.
Sure.
Get info from, because we're kind of locked into one party. We use MERS. MERS. It's all we use. And I'm curious if that's the problem or if there's just some structural thing in the way cities have to be funded, because I know we're under much stricter accounting rules than any private business is. But I'd just like to have that question answered. Is it something that I've been struggling with for 25 years? Is how is it that private industry is able to make a transition? It took them years. They didn't do it like in, a week, but they make the transition to defined contribution. And these are companies that they can't run deficits forever and ever and ever either. So how are they able to do it and we're not? And can we get that explained in some layman's language that doesn't involve the word actuarial?
Probably not. But I can definitely do an overview of the things we're considering, because we seriously considered shifting these last contracts into new hires not having access to the pension. And when we started looking at the cost comparables of what we would have to offer to make that work, I think you'd be shocked at what they were expecting as a comparable, because as a union, they need to provide comparable benefits to their employees. And so you're talking about a match, and I can pull my notes, but I about fell out of my chair when they talked about the contribution that they would negotiate to. And so there's some challenges with the union dynamic, as well as, having some in a pension plan, some are not. We are already seeing that challenge with some that are in different types of plans. We're already starting to see some requests for, because I have a lower plan, then the city should contribute more to a non-pension fund to match what an employee is getting that has a greater benefit.
Okay.
It creates, but I'm happy to provide more detail at a future meeting.
Yep, that's fine. Thank you.
Well, if I read that right, it says our pension total accrued liability is 20 million, roughly. It would help me understand more if I knew like how many retirees are we actually funding? I'd be interested to know that. Is it 2? Is it 5? Maybe I can put it in better perspective if I know based on what our liability is, or is this the liability over the lifetime of the youngest employee we have?
Well, it's a blended liability rate. So it blends across the different types of programs. And then that's a total number of the liability. So it includes your existing retirees as well as your employees that are currently, Michelle, I don't know if you know off the top of your head, I was going to pull the MERS report, but if you know how many are in our retiree.
It's okay. I don't need to know tonight, but if we have it, and I think the mayor is correct. We should have this discussion, and I'd certainly be interested in hearing it. We don't necessarily need to do it all tonight because we're not going to change it tonight.
So I found just from the 2018 report, it says, inactive employees or beneficiaries currently receiving a benefit is 37. Inactive employees entitled but not receiving the benefit yet is 28. Active employees is 44. So you're talking about a combination of 109 that we're having to fund in different ways or prepare to fund. That was in 2018. It might be a little bit more now.
Yep, it went up 1 based on our last actuarial. So we're at 38 retirees and beneficiaries. And then the 19.3 is our total liability for current employees and retirees.
So we have almost as many retirees. We probably do have as many retirees as we have employees who will get retirement benefits.
Oh yeah, and the retirees our retirees are at a much larger benefit amount than our current employees, which
So as
creates
they-
this gap.
The list, our liability will naturally reduce.
Yes. it's a very morbid goal, but yes, we do watch that.
And we also, there's one other note to note, we also have 19 vested former employees that are no longer at the city, but have earned their retirement through the city. So if you take the 19, that once they get to age, they can start drawing, plus the 38 that's already drawing, that's above our actives. So we've still got them in our liability too, because they've earned it before they left.
All right, thank you.
Hey, Deb.
Yeah.
Well, is it a common practice for all municipalities? Like when our non-union workers, we increase 2%. And then our union workers get an increase of 2%. Do all municipalities match that? Or is that just what makes us much more fantastic for our non-union employees? Like, is that just something we do, or is that a standard practice?
Well, so I think it depends on the municipality and it depends on the circumstances. Unfortunately, non-union employees tend to take the brunt of economic impacts more than union employees because they have negotiated contracts that were outside of those economic constraints. If you remember the last year, while we did allocate 2% for our non-unions, it was a lump sum payment, so it didn't go into an increase in wage for them. So they're starting at the same wage they were last year, so they're not getting that compounding benefit that our union employees are. So we tried to find a way to still give them an increase, but in a way that didn't have as big of an impact, so we didn't know what the COVID impacts would be. So it depends on the situation. I think it creates a difficult dynamic if we have our non-union not getting what our union employees have received. But that's not to say there aren't times where that's justified.
I like it. I just wondered if I think it's good for morale. All right, thank you.
It's quite common, Rita, in public and private. As a former union president that had 500 union employees, and then there's another 120 that were non-union. Whenever we negotiated a pay increase, they gave the same level or even a little higher to the non-union.
Any other questions on general fund? Okay, so now we're going to move into special revenue funds. So when we talk about special revenue funds, there's a good, easy way to think about these is they're earmarked for a particular purpose. For us, that's our major and local street funds. So when we look at this, these are projects that are part of the CIP that fall into these project categories. Columbia and the Maple Street all fall under our major streets. Rayner, Eugenia, and Hall all fall under our local streets. We're setting that goal of making sure that we're hitting our 4 mil appropriation and following through with that in an investment. I can't tell you how many communities reach out to me to talk about this millage allocation goal for streets. It's really it is the model for communities who wish they would have done it 20 years ago. And I really am thankful that we did it here in Mason because it really allows us to maintain our roads in an efficient way. So there's not a lot of exciting things in the local and street that you haven't seen. You've already seen these road projects and you have an idea of what's being proposed. This is a map that you saw in the CIP to kind of give you our 3-year projection. The orange is what's planned for this summer. Green is what's planned for the next summer. Now that may change if we start to prioritize Maple Street Bridge. Councilmember Clark, I was more and more concerned after we got off and had our break about how we could make that work because there's just so many things tied together to prioritize that street for the next year. So we may have to come up with something creative regarding the handrails to keep it where it is just because of there's also work planned on Ash and some other things that would be challenging if we did it at the same time. So we'll come back to you with a proposal, but this gives you an idea of what was in the CIP and how we map it out and make sure that we're avoiding conflicts where we can. The other two categories or other funds that we have in this category are the Building Inspection Fund and the Rainer Bond Fund. So we've talked a lot about the Rainer Bond Fund, and you want to stay focused on the cash on hand versus the actual fund balance, because some of that includes property values and things like that that we get the revenue off. And then the Building Inspection Fund is something we implemented a couple of years ago to really do a better job of accounting for the actual costs related to building inspection and the charges that we should be making for fees. So I know community development is doing a great job of really taking this year to track and make recommendations on fees that will actually cover the cost associated with building inspection. So the next area is tax increment financing. Those of you that are familiar, tax increment financing works where basically when those districts are put into place, they cap the taxes, and then the increment above from that date goes to this authority who has the ability to spend on projects that they have an approved plan. So the two districts that we have in Mason are our Downtown Development Authority and our Local Development Finance Authority. So the DDA encompasses primarily our traditional downtown, but it also goes out to Michigan Barnwood and through some of that Antiques District. It also includes Lee Austin Park. And so they really have made that a priority of something that they view as an entrance to downtown and really identifying what improvements could be made there to make it more inviting to come into Mason. Their money, again, is allocated as a tax increment. And so we've really tried to, in all of our funds, do a better job of accounting dollars where they really belong. And so there were some changes in their budget, but they had to do with things like we're charging trash removal of the downtown trash cans and things like that to the DDA, making sure that we're billing to them the unique services that the DDA gets that other business districts do not. And so that it's truly reflective of what the DDA expenditures are. The Local Development Financing Authority really has one project teed up, which is the wastewater treatment plant. That is the last project in their plan. They also fund our commitment to LEAP as an economic development partner. They fund that through the LDFA, but then the only other expense is related to the wastewater treatment plant. So the wastewater treatment plant, they're funding, they'll be able to cover majority, if not all, of the design in this first step. And then they will be part of the bond financing plan to pay and contribute over the life of the bond. Any questions on TIFs?
I have one quick question.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the fact that the Lee Austin Park improvement design is coming out of DDA. When we're looking at the long-term, I guess, capital for our parks, is there any additional discussion about whether the DDA could be supportive of that? I know there aren't really a whole lot of parks in the downtown, but I do know the Riverwalk obviously goes, through the downtown. Is there any sort of inclusion that we can have with the DDA for future park capital?
Yeah, there's definitely discussion, and the DDA is planning to contribute to that. They're also taking, if you remember, as part of the park plan, signage was an element. So the signage related to downtown, they're also identifying as a priority capital project for them. So they're going to be funding that signage downtown. So in that park plan, they've really taken a couple things that are DDA related and plan to contribute to. I know they have some fundraising ideas if there are improvements to Lee Austin Park, especially if it's a farmer's market. They've already been talking to me about teeing up a patronicity grant, which we just really need to have designs ready and things like that before we can do that crowdfunding for that project. But they're really interested and think that the community would support an investment in that park.
Great, thanks. Just want to make sure we're, looking everywhere.
Yes. We're really trying to tie those projects where they belong. And the LDFA, I think, is another great example of, wastewater treatment and generally isn't something you would target for an LDFA, but we made the argument to all of the taxing jurisdictions that this is a use that was really increased by this development in this LDFA area, and that they should contribute a portion to it. And we got great support from the county and some of the other taxing jurisdictions who have been restricting TIF and support. But for this project, they were actually really on board and felt that it was a good use of tax increment financing dollars. So we're doing the legwork to make sure, if any of you follow TIF at all, I know this may be a nerdy thing to do, but there's a lot of debate about whether TIFs should continue and whether they're being used as they should. And I feel confident that both our DDA and our LDFA are very respectful of our taxing jurisdictions and using the projects in a way that we're getting the money back into use, instead of holding on to it like some jurisdictions have been guilty of doing. Okay, so the next area is our proprietary funds. And in this fund, or in this category, this is the water and sewer fund, which we've had many conversations about, and we know we have some challenges ahead. So we know that, our water sewer fund, the goal here is that it's self-sufficient, that it's funded by our users, and that we're tracking what those capital projects that are coming and that we're planning for them appropriately. We did start a utility rate study, for those of you that remember, last spring, and we delayed it due to COVID because it really started to impact usage rates and kind of where we were headed as far as timelines. We weren't sure how quickly we were going to progress with projects or how financing would look. We feel comfortable with the timeline now, but the challenge is the COVID impacts. And so we're we're recommending that we delay completing that plan until we can get a better feel for the impacts of water usage and how that's going to impact our rates. We think we'll have a better idea this summer and fall on usage that really can drive what the actual impacts of these projects will be on our rates. And so what we're requesting is a proposed rate increase of 8%. We know that's not all we need, but we know that that is an amount that's reasonable to get us at least a little bit closer to our goal. And this will allow us to ease into that rate increase. I wanted to share kind of our water rate trends and how you can see these increases have happened. I really want to make sure that whenever we do get to that evened out of water sewer revenue to expenditures, that we built in regular, accurate increases so that we don't have these big jumps when it gets to a need for a certain capital improvement or things like that, that we can plan for those, know they're coming, and figure out how we finance them appropriately. When we look at comparing, I know I've talked with some of you about this. I always have heartburn when it comes to comparing to other cities because every system is different, and it's not really fair to pick on a Williamston or a St. Louis or something like that, because their system may be so different. They may soften water, they may have older infrastructure, but I know in talking more about it, the reality is that this is what it costs to pay for water and sewer when you go to another community. And so comparing them, I think, is a fair reflection of what does it cost to get this essential service that you have to get, and you don't have a choice when you move into a community. So when we look at where our rates are compared to some of those others, you can see that even our proposed increase of 8% is still on that low end of these comparable communities. And we can reflect that in this chart. You kind of see where we're at. And, you start to see where like Leslie is, who's close by, and seeing their rates. But Williamston is not that far away, and you can see comparatively where their rates are to us. And that's because they've had some major capital that they've had to fund over the, more recently. And I know Grand Ledge, for example, had a major rate increase in the last couple of years because they had a lot of capital they had to fund. We're in the same boat as so many of the other communities. If you've had infrastructure put in around the same time, they're all deteriorating at a similar rate. And a lot of them have low lead and copper replacement and things like that, like we do, that require us to have those capital costs increase. So I wanted to share this just because I thought it was interesting when we talk about our wastewater treatment plant and what we, in our water treatment plant, what we bill versus what we pumped versus what we treated. This is an interesting chart. We definitely have users that don't use water, so that's a potential opportunity for increase, like Dart, they don't use water. But there's also an increase in our storms, in our major storms. I mean, the data shows we're up 128% in storms that cause 2 inches or more in rain. And so that is causing some of this infiltration and things like that. So we know we have a lot of work to do in the system, that we really have to figure out where those gaps are and where we're seeing those increases considerably related to a storm. But I think this is good information that we just need to be constantly tracking and working on the system to how do we make sure that we get those figures closer to where they should line up related to users that are not using water. So you all have seen this is our wastewater treatment plant and challenges we have when we have large rain events and what it looks like in that area. I'm just doing this because we know it's a reminder that we need to make the investment. We need to keep moving forward in those pieces to make sure that we're meeting the needs of our community. And I think you've seen that our community really feels strongly about diverting into the creek and things like that. They want us to correct this issue and they want us to fix it. And so we're moving forward with that. Okay, so the next fund is, well, before we move on, I know water and sewer is a challenging topic and we're asking for a rate increase. So if there's any questions before I move on to motor vehicle pool on that, we can cover those.
All right, I'll be the guy to ask the first question.
Okay.
Deb, I know you obviously look at a lot of surrounding communities and consult with a lot of other city managers when you look at these types of issues. I'm curious, given that, communities were looking at moratoriums on water shutoffs and things during COVID, what is the appetite across the board among cities to do water rate increases on the heels of COVID?
Well, it's interesting because we actually had an internal discussion about how do we talk about this with the community during this time. And someone who works in our water treatment plant said, it's the reality of it costs this amount of money to run a plant and fix a plant. There is no easy way to say this is the amount it costs to provide you the service that you want as a basic service. And no one likes to think about when they flush their toilet that there's going to be a problem, or that when they turn on their faucet that they're not going to get water, or any of those things. They don't want to think about that because they just view it as a basic service. And so is there an appetite for rate increases? I think it's a challenging time, but I also could tell you that most communities are under the restrictions of the lead and copper requirements that require them to make major investments in this time period. Will some of them shift some of those increases by using some of their Recovery Act dollars to use for water replacement and things like that? Yes, but for most smaller communities, that's not going to be enough of a difference to justify not needing to do an overall rate increase eventually. I mean, before COVID, you were seeing communities do 50, 60% increases to deal with their infrastructure costs. I mean, these were not unusual rate hikes, but there is some strategy here to not do the full or a larger increase right now. We're trying to get over the hump of COVID, do a smaller increase now that would then, we can evaluate further into the winter where hopefully we have a better adjustment of where we are.
Deb, one thing to remember about this is that, you talk about the services that people want. This water treatment plant was not anything that we wanted. This was something that was forced down our throat by the feds, and it cost us $8 million to build this thing. And we went through some substantial increases when we first built that plant and brought it online. So by now, we should be seeing much smaller increases instead of these large jumps like this. So something's out of whack. We had an actuarial, or we had it spread out over a period of years. We had the tables and all that kind of stuff that told us where we had to be to maintain. And I don't know where it got out of whack, but it's out.
Well, where it got out of whack is we've had a ton of regulations put in place in the last couple of years. I mean, you're talking about massive regulation on stormwater, massive regulation on wastewater, massive regulation on lead and copper. I mean, these are all mandates that cities have to meet their permit. That's it. There's no, like, you will be out of compliance and have fines if you're not meeting your permit. And so when you talk about, what's gotten out of whack, well, we're under a consent order for our wastewater treatment plant. We've now divert on a regular 2 to 3 times a year because of increase in stormwater. All of these things are driving investment, but I don't think investing in the wastewater treatment plant or the DPW is a surprise. I think from my understanding, the city knew they had to do that for years. And so that's not anything new. So that would have been a huge rate increase no matter what you were doing because of just the large capital associated with
No,
it.
I'm not talking about wastewater. I'm talking about the water treatment plant.
I guess I'm not following because it's the
Didn't you
same
say,
fund.
didn't you say an 8% increase in water? Drinking water?
It's an overall rate increase of 8% in rates for the water sewer fund.
And waste, okay.
And keep in mind, I think, Deb, if I remember right, reading from the budget message, it's a good chunk of the 8% is related to the fact that thanks to the dramatic reduction in economic activity over the last year, we simply haven't sold as much water. And when we sell water, that's how we fund the water plant and the wastewater plant. And if we're not selling water, we're not getting revenue to fund them, and the usages are down substantially, and we don't know how fast they're going to come back up. Plus, we've got a wastewater treatment plant project that has to be done that was originally slated for over 20 years ago. And you recall that, Leon, when they put it on hold after Wyeth closed. And then regulations changed again, and we have the consent decree with DEQ that requires us to make the changes there. So it's funny, the longer we've waited to do the wastewater treatment plant, the more the regulations have changed, and circumstances such as COVID have come into play to make it even more expensive.
Definitely.
Just as one more question.
Yeah.
I have been listening to the Monday at noon from the MML, and they were talking about some of these, the funding coming back to us being used for things like the water treatment plant. And this was a one-time use because it's one-time funding, well, two times actually. But is that something that we could use to offset some of the rate increase?
Yeah, you're talking about the Recovery Act, and
Right.
So the significant portion, about over 50%, will be used for lost revenue. So that will avoid an additional increase related to lost revenue. And then the remaining will go to water infrastructure or sewer infrastructure
Thank you.
to limit the impact. The challenge is it's just not enough money to have as much of an impact as we would like, with usage being down and how long.
Right, I just wasn't clear onto that we could use some of it.
And
there.
I want to be clear, we're overturning every rock we can to try to find additional money to fund these things.
Yes.
And we hope that some of the other funding, we know there's going to be more transportation money. We know there's going to be some other funding coming out through other programs. We know there's some lead and copper money. We're applying for it all. We're trying to get whatever we can and teed up so that we can reduce the overall costs.
Thank you.
Deb?
Yeah.
Real quick, I imagine a lot of the loss on the sewer side is the empty buildings at DART. Do you have any indication when they're gonna ramp back up?
I do not, but I'm not actually sure that majority of it is that, because we're down in water, and they don't use water. But a
I
lot
just
of it,
imagine-
but we do have some, obviously we would have some down in sewer use, but you got to remember, we went through a time period. Well, even now our businesses are at significantly reduced capacity, and that overall usage is down considerably,
But Dart does pay us, even though we don't sell them water, we have a different funding mechanism with them. They
Yeah.
pay us
Yeah.
for sewer, for a quantity of sewer, but they pay for a do they pay on a per gallon they use of the sewer? Or do they pay just a flat fee for a max amount of sewer that they use?
I just got information texted to me that Dart is down a little bit, but the Stomp is down by half. So that's majority of where we're seeing, and all the restaurants are having, those are all that combined is our high users. But the Stomp is really, they're one of our top users. When we have challenges with our water towers or things like that, we ask them to slow production because they have such a big impact on their usage, and they're down half this year. So that shows you, the impacts of shutdowns. Any other questions? So John, I think I skipped over your question as far as when we think they're going to get back online. I know that they're returning to some production, but we did hear from some of their staff that their office employees have now been told that they may be till the end of the year not back in their facilities. So I think it depends on the type of employee and what they're doing. I know their production facilities are back, but just not at the level that they were before.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're getting to fiduciary and permanent funds. And this would include these are where we're the trustee of funds and where they're restricted for a particular use. And so this includes our Economic Development Corporation Fund and our Cemetery Trust Fund. And so we are evaluating whether there's any benefit to us ending the Economic Development Corporation Fund, or now that we have spent it down, which was our goal in economic development activities, which was paying for LEAP. But there may be opportunities when we see things like the Recovery Act where there may be a project that we would want to put money into this category. We just don't anticipate any in the near future. So we're evaluating whether it makes sense to close out this fund and then just reestablish it if needed, or we just maintain it as an accounting. On the Cemetery Trust, I want to be clear that I've heard a couple times people say, oh yeah, we have the Cemetery Trust. It allows us to maintain the cemetery. The expenditures that transfer, which is the 500,000 over to general fund, is not covering the cost to maintain the cemetery. So I just want to be clear with that. This is not what this fund is doing in a successful way. We had 46,000 in equipment rental alone to take care of the cemetery. So if that shows you just kind of costs associated, that's not staffing or any of those things. So that's not what's happening with this fund, but it is, that fund is there dedicated for cemetery use. So when we talk about capital improvement funds, these are ones that are specifically to satisfy accounting tracking of certain capital projects in restricted areas. So we know that we have the capital improvement fund that we are going to be utilizing to track the construction for DPW out of. This isn't where we will actually sell the bonds out of, but this will be what it's transferred into to actually deal with the accounting of tracking the funds during construction. And then we have the capital fire equipment fund, which allows us to save up for capital expenses and large equipment. We're really doing some more evaluation of how we split up large expenses and space them out over time versus having them bunch up into similar years. We still need to do a little bit of work on this fund to spread them out a little bit more. So there may be some requests to replace things earlier to get us on a better track and maybe sell that equipment, hopefully getting a little more revenue so that we can spread them out so we don't have these impacts that really make it unsustainable. We want to try to spread out those costs as much as we can. The goal there is to not have any debt related to those equipment. We're planning for them and it's scheduled out. So when you talk about DPW, I just like to provide some pictures of what it is like. This is not a building that is currently appropriate for our employees to be in. They're patching it, they're dealing with it, but we have to stay on target with replacing that facility, and that facility being demoed will allow us to get some additional credits to expand the wastewater treatment plant on that site. We hope that within the next couple of months, we're going to be finalizing at least a site plan concept for you guys to react to on where the DPW will be located near the water plant. We are having conversations with the school. Councilmember Vogel mentioned this. We have always hoped that we could come up with some kind of partnership with the DPW as a combination bus garage. It really helps us being in the same facility because we can talk about these ideas and really brainstorm about the best way. So what we have decided to do at this point is to design it in a way where we can expand to include the bus garage with their needs. So we're talking to them about their needs and setting up the site plan so that that's something that we can add on. They have a lot of interest. They may not be able to move as quickly as we need to move, but we'll be able to design it in a way that it makes sense. And so we're already having some of those conversations about how we can share some facilities, but the project that the city council will see is one that's fully focused on the city, and that any addition would be additional space they would need that would not be shared if they were to come on board, and that would be something they would fund directly. Any questions on that?
You said that they were gonna fund that. Are they paying for any part of the design?
They are not, because their additional space is so minimal compared to the primary DPW facility. So it's really just setting aside, they need a certain amount of square footage that we would need to be able to expand in this direction. We're not doing any further design than that. It's just basically shadowing an area.
Well, I'll certainly be interested to see the design and layout for a $4 million DPW garage. That seems like an awful lot of money for that type of facility.
We will definitely go through and show you the concepts and the designs and why we are not out of line with DPW facilities that are being built in the state for similar cities. In fact, we're actually a little bit under than some of the ones that have been built recently. We're trying to make sure that we're building in an efficient way, but also in a long-term goal of this is a structure that should serve the city for 40, 50 years ahead. And so we need to make sure that we're building it with that in mind.
Well, that includes like storage and maintenance because there's a whole shop in there, correct? So it's not just a
It includes
garage.
storage, and we're also planning to have Station 2 have their items be shifted into that, and that would allow for the sale of that property. So all of that is a goal to be combined into the DPW facility.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so the next category is debt service funds. So this is where we are going to be selling the bonds for the DPW facility. We'd be doing it through the building authority. And then the special assessment is where we track any special assessments. What you'll see in this is currently Kearns Road, and then the addition of KIP in 23-24. When we have in our plans to add sidewalk in that area, there will likely be a special assessment associated with that. So that brings us to the conclusion of all of our different funds and the different priorities for the next year. When we talk about next steps, we're really at this stage of staff clarification, corrections. Like I said, there's a couple of things we know we need to tweak, some great suggestions on some of the slides and the highlights that we can update, and we'll make sure we highlight those in a way that you can see the changes. We'll also make the updates related to what the CIP decisions were tonight and make sure those are incorporated. And obviously we're available if there's any questions or just clarifications that you would like to have that are not necessarily priority shifts. If it's, hey, I want to understand this more, or what's the question with that, I think it would be helpful to do those one-on-one or in conversations. But if it's a broader, hey, I want to shift this priority, I think those should happen at a council meeting.
Hey, I have a question, a hey question. You mentioned Kip Road sidewalks. I don't see that in the CIP anywhere.
It is,
Would that be under streets?
nope, it's under parks and non-motorized.
Okay.
It's project 2020 P16.
There it is. Okay. I was looking in the wrong section. Thank you.
That's the great part about the CIP is that we can plan for when we see those special assessments coming. There's no surprises. We know they're coming. We know that those are discussion items that we have to start having now with property owners. But that's the kind of stuff that I think these multi-year budget and projections really help council and staff kind of put these pieces together. That's why I meant some of the challenges with Maple Street is that we evaluated when does the state do construction on Ash? When is the park likely going to be under construction? When is that? And that's why it was prioritized in that year. So if we do move it, we have to think about all those things and figure out how we tee in them together. Any other questions?
So I'll throw out one additional, and this might be more for the mayor. I know sometimes we have the public hearing, at the meeting of the approval, and sometimes we're able to have it, at that first meeting in May. Do we have a timeline, given that, we're very early on into April, when we could feasibly have the public hearing, given all the posting requirements?
I know personally, I always like having the public hearing at the first meeting in May so that the council can react to that and provide feedback to the manager on things we might want to have changed in the budget before we actually act on it. But I know in years past, that's not always worked due to timing of the budget itself. But I think with that being said, the manager, I think, agrees with me, quite frankly, that she'd rather have the public hearing and then have some time to react to what how the council reacts to the public hearing. So I'm hoping that the first meeting in May, we can have the public hearing and then approve it on the second meeting.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Mayor, do you have any plans for further discussion on this document? I mean, the hour is late and I have a lot of questions, but I'm not going to belabor them tonight. We've been here for 6.5 hours now, so, or 4.5 hours, I guess it was, reading it backwards.
Well, first of all, I want to have as much discussion as the council wants to have, but I would ask you, I guess, is it the kind of discussion that we should just have when we approve the budget? Or do you think we should have another workshop to discuss the budget?
Well, personally, I have a lot of questions about, I don't know, some of the direction that some of this is going in, and some of the, I mean, it's all tied back to funding CIP and that kind of stuff, which is supposed to be. So I don't know.
Well, I know you're very, very aware and totally understand how the process works, that the manager eventually is going to make a budget proposal to us, and it's going to be her proposal. And then once that's made and somebody makes a motion to adopt it, then we decide if we adopt what she proposes or we make changes to it and adopt it. So if you think it's the kind of thing we should have a discussion of the council and discuss some priorities in advance, I'm sure the manager would appreciate hearing that. But ultimately, the budget proposal that we get to consider is going to be her budget proposal. And so I'm open. If you wanted to have another workshop or something, we could, and I could talk to Deb about that. Maybe we could plan, and I could get a feel from her when she thinks she might be prepared to do that, because we have had some discussion tonight through the CIP and this meeting that's probably going to, I think, lead to some adjustments that we could, I think we could certainly have another meeting that we discuss the budget.
Well, I don't even know if you need another workshop, depending on, I have no idea what the council agendas look like for the next couple of meetings. But if it was necessary, you could keep it as an agenda item and talk about it during the meeting. But like I said, I think for me, I think that the administrator would much rather have us have those discussions before the public hearing, and then after the public hearing, react and change, and then she has a very short time frame with which to react. So if you're dragging it out into May, you know, if you want to have your public hearing on May 1st, then that really doesn't give, if there's any changes to be made then, that doesn't really give her a whole lot of time if you want to approve it the next meeting in May.
Well, it's all the time she would have because it's got to be done by the second meeting in May. Let me let Deb and I have a conversation about that. And I guess what I will commit to is I think we probably should have another discussion about the budget at some level. And we'll try to pick a meeting in April when we can have it.
Mr. Mayor,
Well, I'm just trying to be sensitive to
No,
her and her time and give her as much leeway as possible so far as, you know, making changes or reacting to possible changes.
Well, at the risk of inappropriately speaking for the city manager, who I know is going to grin as soon as I say that, I I know she wants to hear council input. So we'll have another meeting. It'll be on the agenda at some meeting in April where we'll have maybe a brief or a more brief introduction, if you will, to where her budget proposal stands, and then we can discuss things and maybe have just a discussion where we bring up topics and try to, you know, basically influence her and eventually get to that first meeting in May where hopefully we have a public hearing on whatever she's proposing and go that route. How's that sound?
Mr. Mayor,
Yes, ma'am.
it would be helpful if there are a number of items. It would be lovely if we could have a list before the meeting so that we could then look up the budget numbers and be informed before we start discussing.
And I think we can incorporate that in how we put together the plan to review this. I mean,
Thank you.
I or Deb could send out a message to the council that says, hey, get me your questions, and then we could have those incorporated and have those maybe partly answered in advance and then have further discussion about it.
Thank you.
I believe that this is the single most important thing the council does every single year. And I think it's important that we have as first of all, a structured process for evaluating, but as complete a process as possible. So I'm fully open to having more discussion about it. And I think it'll only help the manager and what she ultimately proposes. Is there any other comment on the budget proposal?
Mr. Mayor,
Yes, ma'am.
I just want to echo that. I think it'd be great to talk about it. That way we're all kind of already on the same page when it's time to approve and we're not drawing that out. And then I just wanted to thank staff and Deb for all of this. I know it's a lot and it always presents very well. One thing, you know, for any staff that's listening, you know, often I don't really have a good gauge on how hard you guys are working, other than I just know there's a lot going on. And so when I see the numbers and staff time, you know, that really helps. So I really appreciate it. So thank you.
Any other comments? All right. We will be adjourned officially this time. Bang the gavel. Take care, everybody.